Do a quick round of introductions and then we'll get right into it. So my name is John Kelty. I am actually a biologist and bioinformatics guy by training who, through a bunch of curves of career now, have dual roles. So one is as the chief data science officer at a startup company called Decibel Therapeutics, and the other is at Third Rock Ventures, which hopefully some folks that have heard of, and Decibel is one of our companies.
Awesome. So I'm Molly Gibson. I am currently an associate at Flagship Pioneering. Originally trained as a computational biologist in the microbiome space. And so immediately prior to Flagship, I worked for one of the portfolio companies, Kaleido Biosciences, developing chemistries to target the microbiome, building out their computational and data platforms.
Does this one work as well? Looks like it works. Hi, I'm Rory McNeil from ResearchBase. And we provide an electronic lab notebook that's used in universities and biotechs. And it's distinguished, we think it's distinguished anyway, from other electronic lab notebooks by the fact that we connect with all sorts of other tools and resources that people use.
And my name is Alok Tai. I'm the CEO of TetraScience. My background is about a decade and a half of scientific research spanning chemistry and biomaterials. And then started TetraScience about 3.5 years ago. And we're a data platform for the life sciences industry.
So my name is James Weiss. I'm a partner at Nest Bioventures, which is a new venture fund focused on what we call kind of next generation biotechnologies. I'm also currently the CEO of Nest Biolabs, which is a co-working space we've launched for bio entrepreneurs. And so education-wise, trained at MIT, did graduate work in the artificial intelligence lab at MIT in ECS, and also did some PhD work in computational biology, also at MIT.
Great. So one of the interesting things about biotech is the thing that ends up being the driver of value, right, is generally a proof of concept in a clinical trial. But I'm here to argue that despite that fact and that is going to be the value driver, one of the key ways of getting there is to sort of treat our companies as data companies, because at the end of the day, it's the data that's going to get us that proof of concept. So maybe with that, I can ask Molly and James and whoever else might like to opine just a couple of questions. So one, in that context, why should biotechs be thinking about their data strategy? Why should they be doing it early? And I'll just throw it out there. Why has this not been a priority?
So I mean, first of all, I think one of the things that's interesting about that question is why hasn't it been a priority? And because, as you said, data is at the core of everything we're doing. It's at the base of the science that we're forming and to develop these therapeutics. And I mean, a lot of the arguments that I hear are things like, because biology's hard, it's complicated, it's complex, all of these reasons, and so how are machine learning, how is data actually going to transform that? And actually, in reality, when I think about it, actually, that's the exact reason why we should be having a data strategy and a data plan from the very, very beginning. And that data in itself is starting to become a value driver and really an important part of all of our companies and how we're thinking about their value. And so I think that's one of the big changes and one of the big reasons. Other thing is it's hard. I mean, as companies are moving, companies have to get off the ground and fast. Being able to prioritize and make data and the infrastructure that you need for that, I think is something that people find almost as a distraction, when in reality, in the long run, it's going to be a benefit. So I think those are some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about reasons to really prioritize it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think it's a nuanced question, and there's social reasons, there's economic reasons, and there's technical reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I think technically, there's backpropagation was rediscovered in the 1980s, right? And this has led to this thing called deep learning, which people have talked about recently, right? And the thing about deep learning and a lot of these new methods that are effectively have existed for decades but are being rebranded is that they scale with increasing amounts of data, right? So we've had these shallow learning methods since like the 60s, basically, that Amazon has used, all these people have used, but they don't really scale with the amount of data that's added. right? So you have like random forest and things along these lines. So we're kind of entering this paradigm where the amount of data that we have has scaled beyond the point where the first generation machine learning algorithms have kind of plateaued in their ability, and these kind of like rediscovered deep learning methods are continuing to show, now superhuman performance in certain tasks. So I think that's, on the technical side, one of the more exciting research.
So one of the other things, obviously, at a startup is you've got limited resources, right? So, every dollar you spend is an investment in something. With that in mind, right, and again, thinking a little bit more digital, how do you think about that in the context of, of the startup companies, and how much of your resources do you spend on your LIMS system and, and kick-ass databases versus hiring biologists and chemists, for example?
So for me, I think it depends on what kind of company you're trying to be, and what for any company, you have to have a single value driver, or potentially multiple drivers, but, therapeutics companies have to have single value drivers. And, in the data space, so people often talk about how they have these new algorithms, and they have I've seen lots of companies that are using deep learning. Deep learning is pretty much open source at this point. Like, a lot of these things exist openly. You can take a deep learning researcher and implement most deep learning workflows and most machine learning workflows in like a weekend. So I think what I really look at is what is the moat that a company has in terms of its access and structure of data. I think that's one of two kind of like emerging markets that are being created by like these the coming of or the continued coming of machine learning methods. But I think that's the number one value driver for me, is like, where are you getting your data from? Why can't other people get it? And is it structured in a way that other people don't have, or what's that look like?
Yeah, I think I would add to that also that when we're thinking about the data that we're generating, oftentimes the first thing we're thinking about is, what is the primary reason that you ran an experiment? What is the primary reason that you're doing the science that you're doing? And so you'll run an experiment, answer a question, and come back, and that's the value you get out of it. But in reality, now we're getting to the place where that's not actually the biggest value from that experiment. Is from being able to integrate and actually de-risk programs by being able to have a secondary value to that data by integrating across programs, integrating across experiments. And so it actually, by having this infrastructure, you're investing in the ability to de-risk across many different things and just diversify. So a lot of times we're thinking about creating these platforms, and that's one of the reasons that we think about it. And so I think any investor would be excited about the idea that any data that you're creating, there's many additional follow-on potential, in addition to the first primary reason that you generated that data.
There's a follow-on question to that then. So let me be a little more concrete. So let's say you got your Series A funding, right? You're driving this along, you've got enough money to last for 18 months, right? Maybe 24 if you really skimp, right? And you're pumping a lot of time and energy into how you think about data, right? How is that value creating, right? And how do you then go off to those investors for the Series B and get them pumped up and ready to invest in you in some sort of reasonable step up?
Yeah, it's a hard question because it's very, very company specific, right? So it depends on what kind of company you are and what you're trying to do. So like let's just take an example. If you're a diagnostics company, right, you have to hit a certain threshold that's going to keep investors interested, right? So you should have some understanding of your system, and you should know, if you increase the amount of data that you're training your models with, for example, that's going to lead to improved performance. If it's not going to, or if you've already seen plateaued performance with it, then you should be investing your stuff elsewhere. And I think you can do similar analogies in therapeutic spaces and things like that.
Yeah, I think it does come back to this idea that as you're generating data, you're continuing to open opportunity space to completely new areas that you might not have even thought of before. And so I think by being able to talk about value in that way, talk about the idea that your primary indications, your lead indications, you're creating creating data to support that, but on top of that, you have 10 follow-on things that you could be doing and could be learning about. And so I think any investor that wants to think about de-risking a company, if one of those first things it doesn't end up working, you've started to generate a platform that leads to a lot of additional information. And so I think just in that regard, it's value creating, and I think that's one thing that people are starting to recognize, and just really monetize data in itself.
Go ahead.
So yeah, even though at Tetra Science we're not a biotech, we work with about 40 or 50 of them. And I think the topic that both James and Molly had touched upon is the fact, I think I describe it as agility, right? I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity that comes about when you have cloud software, you have data in a single place, you have a well thought out data strategy, in part because any scientist knows that the first experiment, the first hypothesis is rarely the correct one, ever. And so it's often those organizations that...
I've never had that problem.
As an early millennium guy, I feel like, only you guys could sort of make that sort of claim. But for the rest of us lay people who haven't had the luxury of being part of that mafia, I think the balance of us, have to rest on our wits and our ability to come up with new ideas very rapidly, and then also be willing to admit when we failed in a certain area, and then shift into a different direction. And I think the big thing that I think Molly sort of articulated really well, which is that as one sort of has all that data in a single place and in a certain platform, it provides the opportunity to shift and leverage historical knowledge to drive the next set of experimentation. So, though I'm not a biologist, I'm a material scientist by training, and not in a biotech, it strikes me that the concept of agility and the ability to learn from historical mistakes also strikes me as value.
Sure. I'm going to go totally off script for a second just to mess with you guys. So I actually think you brought up a really good point, which is each biotech company is not created equal, right? And I can speak for the Third Rock model, which is the value creation event that we put on our Gantt chart when we start has nothing to do with data directly, right? It has everything to do with getting a molecule into a clinical trial, or just so happen to be around a really sexy, exciting technology that you can go public even before you've got something in the clinic. I wish all of the companies were created that way. But the real value driver, of course, is getting some proof of concept in the clinic, right? Now, that said, for every, let's call 8 to 10 of those, there's a flat iron, right? There's some example. Even in the context of Third Rock, we have some companies that are much more data rich. Throw this out to the whole panel. Like, how do you think about dialing up or dialing down the level of investment, right? And should we, who are investing in these early stage startups, think of pumping a little bit more money into these things earlier, such that we can get the data strategy right?
I mean, I'm always in favor of collecting more data, so that's the easy answer for me. I think when you talk about any company that's driven by decisions that are enabled by machine learning, collecting data to the point where the incremental value that you add is negligible is always valuable. And just like Molly said, when if that's not leading directly to the therapeutic efficacy or the predictability that you need, it's also ideally, especially if it's captured in a way that gives you kind of a holistic understanding of what's going on, leads to future decision making. That is, so just to echo that, I think that's also So it, dollar value is tough to assign, but I think generally speaking, as long as you're learning something from what you're adding, it's a pretty good investment. That's good value.
I'll comment that as well. I think it's not necessarily the case that you need to throw a lot more money at it. A lot of times getting better organized with your data is more a state of mind and an approach, and not an investment in heavy duty hardware or software. So it could be more expensive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So it's partly a matter of, it could be a matter of putting more money in, but it could also be a matter of doing a little bit of thought work, as they say in Chinese.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that one. I mean, I think early on, a lot of times you can get by with being able to use pretty inexpensive and lightweight tools to actually get you where you need to go. And if you make those types of investments, or very early in the company, you can start to really add value and demonstrate value of data, and start to quantify how much money you should be investing in each one of these data platforms. And so I echo that perception that you don't necessarily have to be spending large dollars, although it helps.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And obviously part of the investment is also having the right expertise on the team. So I think one of the real challenges I know that we run into with some of the third round companies, we invest a lot of money in our companies to start up. We don't necessarily we've gotten much better, I think, but historically didn't have the right person there to be driving the technical innovation, right? So you tend to sort of say, well, I've done it this way before, why would I change, right? Look at how well our model works. From my perspective, it doesn't really appear that biotechs as a whole are leveraging their data effectively, right? And so within this same framework, right, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think you can best use that for things like improving and driving the actual science, right? And as long as I'm throwing buzzwords out there, I love machine learning, right? We were doing neural net algorithms at Millennium back in the day. I would still argue that, and maybe you guys can opine on this, because it's not just about having tons of data, it's about having really good data to train your machine learning algorithms on, right? Because there have been so many of these silver bullets that have come on. I've been doing this for a long time. Every 3 or 4 years, you've got the next thing that's going to solve everything, right? So being careful about how you invest and having, again, the right expertise to understand that just because I go to Amazon and I've got a new machine learning, module doesn't necessarily mean I know, how to train that the right way and whatnot. In that same way, I think you can cut costs pretty considerably with the public clouds, right? Do we know how to, secure those the right way? Do we know how to leverage those in a cost-effective manner? So, it's a twofold question, right? So one is, how do you guys think about leveraging these cutting-edge tools? And I love the folks on the technology side to opine on that a little bit as well. Maybe we just start with that one, or maybe we start with some of you technology guys.
No, Brent's me first.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think one of the key issues, and this also comes to your point about A, things are moving quickly, and B, getting people with the right expertise. In some cases, people with the right expertise means people with an open mind, because things are changing rapidly. So I think one of the big challenges that we see from the point of view of a technology provider, but I can imagine it's also a challenge if you're sitting on the other side of the fence, is coming back to one of Molly's points, is things need to be interoperable. So these days there's a bewildering array of new machine learning tools, but all sorts of new different kinds of tools and platforms. So the issue is you want all the data in one place, but before you know it, what seemed like the best place yesterday is no longer the best place 6 months from now. So you need to have interoperability, and you need to be forward-looking. And so when you're designing the technology, you need to be thinking about that. When you're procuring the technology, you also need to be thinking about how interoperable things are. So I think interoperability is a key focus and a key challenge.
When I look back to how sort of pharma and the biotech industry has sort of developed software historically, it's usually been employing hundreds, if not thousands, of software engineers internally to develop a lot of the infrastructure and the capabilities. I think the biotech and life sciences industry is undergoing two interesting trends. The first is the shift from on-premise sort of personally developed software to cloud, which I think eliminates the need for a lot of people internally to be experts in that domain, and puts the burden on folks like us from a technology perspective to make sure that's available at the click of a button. But the other part of it I think that's also interesting is that the operating model of life sciences also is changing, which also makes our lives harder as well, where probably a place like Decibel and Kaleido where we were before, and maybe your portfolio companies, for every one scientist internally, you've probably got 3 to 5 externally. That's a very different operating model than there was 5 to 10 years ago. So though I'd love to be able to sit here in a straight face, say that we've got it right and everyone should give us hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, I think the reality is that both as the science changes as well as the operating model changes, I think the technology has to keep up, but the benefit of cloud specifically gives you that sort of push button access.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we should touch on, even though it seems obvious, I've seen this in multiple companies. For example, when you're thinking about your data collection strategy, you have to think not just how much money am I putting in here, how many samples am I getting, but also like how well am I sampling the space that I'm interested in. So I've seen, for example, like protein engineering, machine learning companies that will come and say they have this great algorithm, they can predict, the ability of X protein to do X thing like extremely well. And it's great, very exciting. And then you look a little bit deeper and they've trained their model on something like millions of samples, all of which are good and 0 which are bad. So this model has basically learned to replicate the things that they've already shown it. There's no actual learning taking place here. And these companies, will often raise millions of dollars and get to a certain point, which is I guess, potentially a poor use of this capital, right? So something to think about.
So maybe I can expand on the collaboration piece because I think that's really huge, right? And you're right, there are companies now that start, and rightly so. You'll have a couple of guys in a garage, right, with a bunch of funding, and you outsource things to Wuxi, you outsource things to Charles River, right? You've got some great cloud providers, and you've got your stuff running in Amazon with some computational biologists. That, in theory, adds a layer of complexity to how you think about your data, right? I mean, this data now will be in different places. How do we think about pulling that together? Is it worth it? Or, turns out I think Excel now you can have more than the 64,000 rows, right? Is that? So I'm just wondering how folks think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges is you're talking about people from CROs, but and externally in the company, but internally in companies, across all different functions, we're recognizing that biology is drug discovery. It's a team sport. It's something that you need to have everyone involved in, and everyone having access and really having really democratizing data. I think one of the and these tools are one of the ways that we can do that. And so it's an important piece of how we build these companies. And it was interesting because I think one of the things that I learned early on is that people like to own data. That ends up being a huge kind of challenge in biotech companies because it's all it's much more valuable as a shared resource, everyone having access to it. And so putting a lot of effort into some of the stuff that we've worked on with external people as well, to be able to bring all of that data into one place and making sure that everyone has the opportunity to use it and access it, which also includes things like adding tools on top that allow biologists to view complex data in really interesting and fascinating ways. Makes everyone a part of the process, and everyone see everything that's going on. And so I think there's a lot of complexity to the tools that are going into that. I think we'll have some other experts on the panel that can speak to how those things play together. But it's an important process that needs to take place in any biotech if they're going to have a data strategy, so that we can use it to its fullest capacity, and the company is viewing it as a positive benefit to everybody that's touching the science or touching the data.
So I think, we've been talking about biotech companies and therapeutics companies, but I also think, especially in the healthcare space, the ability of machine learning to leverage data for new insights, broadly speaking, is just starting to be tapped. And a lot of that is because of the siloed nature of healthcare data and the fact that a lot of people in healthcare, like you're saying, don't like to share. But I do think that every bottleneck, actually is often an opportunity for someone, right? And I think there's actually two enormous markets that are just starting to be, that aren't therapeutics, but they're, data technology companies that are just starting to emerge to address this. And I think the first one is interoperability, right? So taking data from many different sources and bringing it together in like a computable way, like some people here do, right? I think that is going to become an underlying layer that these analysis companies are going to be built on top of, and it's going to become critical, right? Because you have all these different data providers, but they do have to be unified or at least computed on in some holistic way. So I think that's one market that's emerging. The other market that I think is very interesting is that these service providers and these platforms have to eventually interact with people, right? So just like you're saying, say someone owns data, other people are going to want to compute on that data, and every point where a data collection place connects with a human or a human entity represents like a potential market, like a data market, not a large market. And I think we're just starting to see data marketplaces come out and things like this. But I would expect that this is going to become a fundamental layer of the infrastructure that's going to be supporting a lot of these biotech companies.
Yeah, just to pick up on both of those points. So to give a concrete example, I think something else that is challenging is understanding, again, how different tools can fit together. And sometimes the tools are already being used, but aren't being used to the optimum amount. And sometimes they're really pedestrian tools, they're not specialist tools. So I'll just give an example, talking about inter-organizational collaboration. So we've done an integration with Slack, a two-way integration, so you can export, you can have a conversation about the work that you're doing inside the ELN and export that to one or more Slack channels that you're working on. You can also search the ELN from within Slack for people who are too busy to get involved with the ELN. And you can also insert conversations from Slack into the ELN to associate that with data. So, and this is definitely useful in an internal context, but it's extremely useful potentially if you're dealing with, say, one or more CROs as well. So there's an example of a tool which probably most people are already using and don't think about as a research tool, where with a little bit of effort it can be quite easily incorporated in a productive way into the research cycle.
Maybe you can expand on that a little bit. So when we think about tools like that and adding some social media features to things like ELN, does that end up being a hook for folks? And how do you think about that, adding those sorts of features in terms of actually driving value for your company, right? Is that something that is so compelling to folks like us on the other side that would say, oh my gosh, I totally need that product, right?
Well, I guess we're going to find out because you're supposed to tell me. You're supposed to tell me that. I mean, it's all relatively new. So you can lead the horse to water, but will the horse drink?
Yeah.
It's definitely. I mean, we've only just done this, so it's a bit early to say. But to me, it's quite compelling, and it also relates to another issue. Coming back to what James was saying, which is, and again, I want to hear Alok speak to this as well, if you wouldn't mind. Data is being produced there's more and more kinds of data being produced from more and more disparate sources. So machine learning is one, machine-generated instrument data, but Slack, conversations, that's actually very relevant data, which right now is not being captured, and it could be captured. So I think, to answer your question, I think it's going to take a bit of time, but I think we'll get there.
So one of the cool underpinnings of what you just brought up, though, is something that maybe James was touching on before, which is we're definitely heading in a direction where the data is coming in from all over the place. It's heterogeneous in nature. How do we pull that together? If only we had a solution for that. But the other piece to that is sort of general interoperability, right? And certainly things like Docker or things like RESTful APIs have helped a lot with that. I'm wondering how folks that have been on the other end, how you think about that. I mean, even when you're picking solutions, right? You can get things that are cost effective. You maybe don't have to put as much elbow grease in terms of software development to get the sort of bang for your buck you would on the data side of things. And where's the value in sort of thinking about that piece early?
Yeah, I mean, we actually think a lot about using tools that have been developed for these purposes and figuring out how they can actually work together. We've done actually very little internal software engineering, and that's actually worked out fantastic. We do quite a bit of architecture and development to support those systems. But by having these solutions that we're talking about here, we're able to provide and create quite a robust system without developing too many really serious engineering efforts. But you can think about I like to think about like a lot of lightweight apps on top of these systems. And that's where you can add some of your additional, basically, personalization or the needs that a particular company might need. And in that way, we're able to be much more agile. We're able to use that when we need to and move quickly without having a huge amount of overhead. So I think all of these tools are things that allow us to continue to build robust data solutions, but also be moving at a pretty rapid pace.
Maybe one of our technology folks can opine on that, because you're going into these companies and you're seeing this. I don't know, is it really a problem? And if so, what do you perceive as the potential value of being able to pull this together, right? And I mean, I'm not even talking about value for you. I mean value to these companies in terms of pulling that data together, right?
Yeah. So even you mentioned sort of APIs and Docker as being some of the solutions. To be honest, I actually think they're not going to be explicit solutions by themselves, because if my CRO from Wuji versus Pharmaron versus CRL all have different APIs that all perform differently, different standards, and different ways they pull data from, it doesn't matter. It's the same problem, just now in the cloud. So I think a part of it's really thinking about centralization and standardization across that landscape. But the other piece of it, which I think is really critical, and I'm really glad to have both Molly and James here, is because the types of investors or venture creators these folks are ones who back companies that are 3 folks in an office one day, and then in 3 years are like 300 scientists with like 3 clinical candidates, and then like 10 more in the pipeline. And what I've sort of seen done right, and been fortunate to work with Molly, for instance, at Flagship, was previous as how they think about starting with the 3-person, but make sure they're putting the systems and the mindset in place to be able to scale as the organization goes from discovery to development to the clinic. And I think it's that trajectory where I think a lot of the problems happen, and where a lot of the dislocations exist when you hit those inflection points. We see it in personnel, and I think technology is just maybe a symptom or a corollary of that.
I agree.
So I agree with that wholeheartedly. And what I can say is at Third Rock, right, we've spent a ton of time and effort over the last 4 years to sort of get a sort of baseline infrastructure in place, and it's been pretty cool. It gets back to some of the points you were making, that this can be done very cost effectively. We literally set up our infrastructure by running what's called a Lambda script in AWS, and everything just gets provisioned for us automatically. So new company starts, some schmo like me can run the script, and everything is up and running, right? I think it's hard for every company to be able to pull that off, right?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment, because people have mentioned the phrase cost a couple times. And I don't know, for some reason, granted, yes, we're expensive, but the part that always comes back to me on mind is that, like, if you want to run a mouse model, or you want to do like a drug product manufacturing run, that's going to run you at minimum like $250,000, right? For one shot, and you don't even know if that's going to work. And so it just strikes me as like we're talking about different orders of magnitude and spend here when it comes to having the right technology infrastructure, having the right strategy, versus some of the one-off sort of activities you might do from a drug development perspective. So I really don't think, even in the large realm of a $10 million Series A, or a Neon did what, 100, or you guys did what? How much did Regeneron do with Decibel?
It's not public. Nice try.
I got it. I tried. But I feel like in the grand scheme of that, right, the data focus and the data investment, I think is pretty marginal in comparison to the other broader activities from a drug development perspective.
Okay, I'm going to go even more off script so I think it's hard to quantify, right? And being on the other side when you are developing a drug, right? And even if you're a data guy, you know that the most important thing is, all hands on deck to get that first proof of concept, right? And then the trick is doing that while you're building out the infrastructure such that the second, third, fourth, molecules are coming down the pipe, right? Cost is the wrong word, actually. I really agree. It's investment. Where are you making those investments? When do you make those investments? And I honestly think we are in the midst of a bit of a shift in terms of the way people think about things, right? And you see some now, the younger folks that are even part of our firm that go, of course, this is a data company. It makes perfect sense to spend X percentage, right, of our initial seed on the data side of things, where when I started there 5 years ago, honestly, the partners thought the person that was going to set up the data infrastructure was the same guy doing help desk for them, right? So I feel like we're in the midst of this change, which is going to pay huge dividends in the long run. Some of this is going to be, I think, a little bit of patience and how do we get the right people convinced of this. But that's just me. I'd love to hear, am I just misrepresenting that?
No, I agree. I think we are in the midst of a big change, and I think a lot of the underlying data infrastructure is going to end up. The problem is it's the same place where servers were back when the web was becoming a hot thing, right? Yeah, the world. Yeah. So at that point you had to have a server guy who would come into your office and bring computers and host your website in your office. So that required, investment that was relatively significant, actually, if you wanted to launch a website. The amount of investment that's necessary to launch a website now is negligible, right? It's like an intern and a weekend or something like this, depending on, or $40,000 depending if you have a PR firm or not. But I think we're going to see the same thing happen across, it's already happening across most of therapeutics companies, but I think we're going to see a lot of the data infrastructure fall into that, right? And we're already seeing it, outsource data collectors, data aggregators, data marketplaces, things like that. It's the same, we're a big proponent of this, and it's the same reason why we launched a lab space, for example, because we see these small, companies, and their number one value driver is, their science and their technology. That's the most important thing. And yet, they end up bringing on board an operational team of 5 people, 25% of their company is running their lab space or something like this. Or it's 50% of their budget, so you get to choose one of those two. So we're trying to, offload as much of that as possible so that the main value drivers can be the overwhelming focus of the entire company. And I think we'll see that in the data side as well.
Yeah, I think that's, and to follow on that, I think that is one of the big challenges that we talk about, the opportunity cost. It's really not, thinking about the orders of magnitude of financial investment. That's actually not where a lot of people start to balk at it. It's the fact that everybody in the lab needs to be interacting with whatever system you're doing, and anytime you add a new component into a workflow, it's just all hell breaks loose. So if it's a lot about how do you think about time investment as well, and how do you offset that with the fact that these experiments are time sensitive, and everything every minute every day matters for these companies. And so yeah, I don't think we're actually even a lot of times talking about financial costs. We're just really talking about the whole investment in personnel and people and in time, and so it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I think we're in I think we're basically on this side, we're in a fragmented market, right? We're at the place where cell phones were when there was Nokia, and there was the one that you flip out and it has a thing. And then eventually there's just going to be an iPhone and there's going to be Android or whatever, and then that'll be great for them and for everybody else. So the pros and cons to that, but I think that's where we're headed.
Anyone else want to opine? I want to open it up for some questions. I'm just sensitive to time.
Always go ahead.
I'll walk around.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Hi, Cornelia Kroger from the German Accelerator. And I have one question. We're always talking about data as an asset. How can you assure that the quality of your asset is correct? So it can be as simple as me generating data from a cell line that it's not even the cell line that I'm thinking it is. So.
I think Molly should answer this question.
All right.
Well,
Happy to go.
based on our last conversation, I think it's.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big challenge to make sure it's right, and I think everybody's always kind of questioning what biological data is. It's noisy, it's messy, it's complex, and so being able to identify what the right amount of data is, right, make sure that you have the right amount of diversity in the data sets that you're creating, so that you're able to actually learn something rather than just identify the obvious. Those are big challenges, and in some ways, the machine learning algorithms that we have can start to tell you that. They can give you information as to how much you can learn from them. You can start to identify when it's all just kind of one blob of data versus another. And I mean, to your kind of question on the cell lines, I think some of that is going to be very, very, very specific to the types of data you're collecting. I mean, one trend that we're seeing is that we're getting more and more inhuman data. And I mean, I think that's something that everybody is trying to push towards, is how can you get human data faster? Pretty much every I'm in the microbiome space. I think one of the, pretty much every company has a human first discovery type kind of mentality, or they at least are aspiring to do that. And so then you're starting to get into a space of clinical data becoming research data. And so the quality of that data changes, and the amount that you're thinking about the traditional clinical data versus what we think about as traditional research data. That line starts to blur. So so there's a lot of ways we can think about it, but it's messy too.
And just one other point. So I hear you. I've actually had these times where I'm like working on the cell line that I thought was one, and it's really another. That's kind of embarrassing. What I think this is actually a big part of where that initial investment you make and how you organize that data, what you do for QA, building in algorithms like that. You can catch stuff like that saves so much time and energy, and yet it's sort of just assumed that, every once in a while you're going to run into that. And, I don't want to make the right level of investment to sort of catch those mistakes early, because they're going to happen, right? So I would say that that's an argument for investing earlier, both in terms of the systems you select, how you're annotating your data, and then you can leverage these algorithms, right? I mean, to be honest, a lot of we've invested pretty heavily in that for exactly that reason, because we've had a few hard lessons, and you go, oh my God, I can't believe we spent this much time and energy on XYZ. And EHR data, that's just a mess anyway. So that same sort of effort and how you think about that data, I think, is applicable both to research and what I think of as more translational data.
Wim Schiel, I'm executive director at Pfizer. We do clinical research or clinical development and operations. I mean, as you sit here, a lot of data has been generated, right? I mean, not only you have the bit rate of the camera that records you, or the stream rate of your cordless mic, your wearables that record your heart rate that went up during the course of this. James even managed to get a text message out to his venture capitalist because he was concerned about that. So that generated a little spike in his heart rate, which was carefully recorded on his. Absolutely. So coming back to Molly and how you use that data and how I would use that in clinical development and operations as patient data, it still is a little abstract here and there. I mean, it's very noble to say, well, we want to share that type of data early on a molecular level, but obviously there's a lot of proprietary things around that. But can you expand or give us, let's say, a 1-minute pitch of how you see that data, the clinical data, to be used as an example that may be useful for clinical development and operations? Is that a relevant question, or is that out of topic?
Same topic to me.
Yeah, I mean, with clinical data, it's a much bigger challenge, and it becomes a bigger problem. So my experience at Kaleido, we've run about 10 clinical trials at this point, and all of the molecular data, all of the data that we've collected, we have made available to our research team. There is some amount of protection of the human data within the clinical side, but we truly believe that that's going to feed back into our research programs. And so I think there's a lot of questions about security and privacy and everything that we're working through. But the more that the human data can drive the discovery, the better we're going to be. And so we're dedicated to figuring that out. I mean, especially if we get into complex diseases, complex areas that don't have good models. And I'd argue that actually the microbiome is like the perfect place where we don't have a good model. Preclinical models are mostly like questionable. And the microbiome is actually not even the organ is not even really the same. And so how do we actually start to do discovery is something that we think about a lot. So it's a challenge, but one that we're definitely thinking about. How do we get that clinical data back into the hands of the researchers?
I think there's different types of sharing, right? So there's the sharing within a company, which I think Molly's referring to, which is fragmented and generally is it's ridiculous actually when you think about, here's the clinical folks generating this data, they're relying on translational, but translational can't get access to that data. So there's forcing that, right, and then getting what is the appropriate clinical data into the hands of the basic researchers so that everyone can get eyes on that. It's very different to say, here I am at Pfizer or at Decibel, and I'm going to push my data to the outside world. And we're very cautious about that for a lot of reasons. Although I would argue, like in the there are probably avenues to push on that in the translational space, right? So or natural history studies, and more you start to see things like registries pop up where you've got these collaborations. It's a little harder in the interventional studies, right? But I would say, to Molly's point, first step first, which is, can we just get the data shared within the company, right? And then, whatever makes sense, of course, you'd like to see the rest of the world benefit from that, right? Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of us got into this because we actually want to get important medicines to patients. If you can make a few dollars, that's great too, but both of those things are really important.
I'm Sanjay from Jubilant Biosciences. So in the world of competition, when many companies are trying to find patients and there are less patients, and when the venture investors are trying to find the quick answers, there is a big challenge of finding the right patients, right investigators. How do you handle this?
So I can tell you how we think about it, right? So there's a few things, right? So there are companies out there that are focused on pulling that data together, right? Companies that started out, like companies like Sightline, that's all they do. They go through clinicaltrials.gov, they're pouring through that. Now they've built out new products that are getting at how individual sites are doing and whatnot. And you start to see, even within the fragmented EDC market, that you start to see companies like that are spreading out, where they're sitting on a lot of our metadata. That's one of the companies too, ironically, huh? So they're sitting on all this data that they've generated over time. So we end up spending more money than I'd like to try to tease apart that data to sort of get at exactly the question that you're saying. So what are the right sites to go to? Who are the right KOLs? And then once you get down to thinking about, especially in rare diseases or in diseases where you're going with targeted therapies and you have the hammer and you need to find the right nail, so to speak, that's really freaking hard, right? And so this gets back to what I was saying. There's a lot of focus in these early stage companies now on being part of registry studies and natural history studies, because more and more we're jumping into diseases that we that we think we understand, but know that our drug is only going to work on a subset of those. And so with a certain number of the third round companies, that actually ends up being part and parcel to how we start the company in the first place. Building the right relationship with, big institutions, helping them out in terms of, maybe it could be as simple as getting EHR extracts from them, agreeing to do sequencing on their samples. Everybody wins out of that, and what you get out of this is a promise that you're going to push this data to the outside world so other people can benefit, but then we can leverage that in the short term to sort of tease apart our hypotheses around which patients are going to benefit from our drugs. So I would argue that there's no single right answer for that, and even that data on the clinical side of things is pretty fragmented. So if you're trying to get molecular data, which I presume is what you're alluding to, right, that's kind of hard. Getting at, for example, what are the right investigators to go after, at least based on certain metrics, or what are the right sites for certain disease areas, that, a lot of CROs are sitting on that data. There's a lot of companies that have stolen our metadata over the years with our consent and are willing to provide that back to us for the right price tag.
So there was a bunch of talk of centralizing data or pulling things together. What do you do in the case where the data is very big, like genomic data, or in the cases of like European data privacy laws?
If only we had someone who was thinking about data aggregation.
Thanks. It's a really good question, especially GDPR. Next month, I think, right in May, in a week, that's becoming a really big issue. I think for us, we've focused historically on preclinical data, so at least the identifying component has been less of a challenge for us. But you're right, genomics has been a big challenge. Fortunately for us, we're cloud native, and moving data within a cloud environment like AWS is pretty easy to work with. There's also been some really great software that's been developed by companies like Curaverse historically, which has made genomics data available in its local environment that can be analyzed fairly easily from anywhere. And so I think there are some technological solutions that enable it, but you're absolutely right. The ability to have it all physically centralized or even digitally centralized might be hard given its girth, but I think there are some smarter technological solutions, as well as platforms like DNA Nexus and AWS now and GCP, I think provide also some automated analytics that can be deployed even locally or wherever the data might reside, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just second that. So I think the answer is not moving the data, it's finding more effective ways of linking to it in ways which are secure and compliant.
Actually, I think that's a really important point. I just saw this great presentation by Eric Banks, who's over at the Broad Institute, and a big part of what they're doing is setting up the architecture for, talk about a lot of data. I think I have a lot of data. There's just too much of it, and even with them and how much they have, what they've done is come up with clever ways of, the data is really only in one place, right? How do you link to that? Because we're pretty good at generating a lot of data, and with the public cloud, you can store that data. The question is then, you hope you don't have to move it, right? And that's really important. And that requires, I think, a little bit of foresight. I know that's where I've got myself into a little bit of trouble. The other piece, just to keep in mind, is you think like the current genomics are rough. We're starting to do a lot of single-cell RNA-seq, which is even more. And then you start to think about what's coming next, things like these image-based technology like FISSEQ and MERFISH. That's a problem that's only going to get worse. And so if we don't have a good technical approach for not having to copy data from here to there, I think we're all in for it, right? And there's a lot of people thinking very deeply about that. I would recommend, if you look up, Eric's got a bunch of pretty cool presentations that I think are online, and you can at least get a sense for what they're doing over there. It's a pretty good architecture.
As you guys mentioned about like sharing data is hard, right? Like a lot of people want to have the ownership. Have you heard about transfer learning, where you think about transfer learning going to be the solution, one of the solution, sharing the model set and train on a larger set of data instead of sharing the data? And second question, actually on product management. I work for Watson Health. We actually bought like 6 different healthcare companies, and we're building a lot of portfolio, a lot of offerings. What would you say actually also for for Pfizer. What do you say of the things that are not on the market yet that we could actually add to the value? So that would be.
So let me rephrase. So, instead of, especially in the machine learning context, not sharing, data, but potentially sharing models, right? So have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a one solution that people are using all the time right now for aggregating data from companies and actually being able to leverage data across companies and sharing that model. A lot of, actually, I mean, I think coming back to the point that a bigger primary problem, even within companies, is that a lot of research teams don't actually have access to clinical data, which is insane. And so like if you can't learn within a company, how are we ever going to learn between companies? But I think that's that's transfer learning is obviously a way that people are coming up with a solution to be able to learn from the masses of data that we're generating. But yeah, first things are getting our research teams to iterate in a way that allows us to actually learn from clinical data and get our discovery programs even more efficient. As we get into more complex systems and complex target. I mean, it might not be a one target, one molecule kind of approach anymore. And so being able to get that data back into our discovery programs is important. And so that's really when I'm talking about data sharing, I'm talking about a much more fundamental issue within a company. But I'd love to hear about what people are thinking about, across these larger organizations and the amount of data that they're amassing.
I'd love to hear your perspective on, especially on the machine learning side.
Yeah, I think transfer learning is a way, and I think all these ways are going to have their own niche, right? But really, the underlying question that has to be solved, that transfer learning is attempting to kind of address in a holistic way, and I don't think it's going to be able to, is how do you access and compute on data that's stored all over the place, right? That's really the underlying question, and I think, and I do think that methods that allow people to, pay for access to other people's data or things like that. I think there's a whole market that's going to be created there. I think there's going to be people that who are in the business of just producing data, right, and are going to be able to sell that to people. Cureverse is like a great example, right? Like very exciting technology. I think that's the way that things are going to go, because eventually, you don't want to, transfer learning is fine if you're going to do something academic or if you don't have to make too many modifications. But when you want to include your own data, then and you want to build your own models, but incorporate things from other places or other populations, it starts to become inadequate.
Maybe we can squeeze in one more. No one's kicking us out yet. All right, well then, what great moderating. We're stopping just on time. This is brilliant. All right, well, I thank everyone, and I think I speak for all of us. We're happy to answer any questions individually afterwards. So thanks a lot.